Isaac, let's hear it.
Oh, Rabbi, so good to see you. How are you?
Great, great. Let's hear some questions.
So last week we discussed we discussed where the verse Jesus says, "Do not think I came to abolish the law of the prophets, but I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And we discussed how this is a call to adopt the Jewish life or the Pharisee model of living, where you have to keep these commandments of don't eat pork and don't do this and don't do that. And so, at least based upon this verse, that's one take on this. But here's my question, right? So the preceding section, when Jesus is blessed are you, blessed are this, it sounds as though he has some authority to make these statements just come out of nowhere, right? It's not as in like when Moses gave the commandments, is because he saw the face of God, or he saw God. But so that has some authority. But versus this, right? It felt like if somebody were reading for the first time, it might feel like Jesus is going against the law by making these statements which look arbitrary. And was he clarifying this? With the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are you for the meek, the merciful, the kind. And then he's saying, oh, by the way, I didn't come to abolish the law, if that's what you're thinking, but rather I came to fulfill the law, as in, I'm not saying that you have to go against the law, or these statements I make are opposed to the law, but as much as I lost my train of thought, right? I lost my
Oh,
train of thought.
you're bringing up the point.
Uh,
It sounds like you're bringing up the question of how authoritative, even let's start from the beginning. It sounds like from the beginning of the Beatitudes, how authoritative could Jesus' statements really have been,
mhm.
independent of Mosaic law or Pharisaic law? And I think the question is, how does one come to power? When you think of a king, which is what I guess what when we look at the Magi, what we believe that Jesus is claiming to be from the Matthean perspective. How does one who's not born a king, at least in a sense that his father was king and he's just inheriting it, how does he rise to power? How does he eventually have people follow him? How is he an authority figure to either interpret the law and or interpret the way that you should live your life? So there's no really simple answer to this, but it's a process. So I think you're kind of noting like in the middle of the process. Jesus is not dead. The process somehow ends when Jesus dies, or maybe you think it's going on until today. I don't know. But there's the idea that Jesus seems to be developing his ideas. In the Beatitudes, I don't think he says anything controversial from the point that it's conflicting or contrasting to a high degree
Mhm.
with what we'd expect. What we're going to see actually, even right after this section, we're only going to do one verse, God willing, eventually. But what we'll see after is when we talk about how it's bad to murder, it's also bad to insult. We're going to see this idea of, which we'll discuss, of supererogation, what we go going beyond the letter of law. And I think that what Jesus is describing in the Beatitudes is going beyond the letter of law. I don't think any rabbi, Pharisee, or any religion would really cast aspersions upon someone who says, it's good to do the law, but it's even better to try harder. And you could definitely understand Jesus as coming from that perspective, especially the Beatitudes. You say it's not good enough to think that you're just good enough because you were born this way, or that Abraham is your great great grandfather. It's important to understand that your framework and the context which you think is problematic,
Mhm.
and we need to adjust. So I don't think that is an authority issue, and I don't think when he said it, if he taught it and or preached it, it would have been controversial even. People have been like, wow, this guy's pretty creative in saying poetic line things.
Mhm. Yeah, so yeah, well, thank you for the clarification. Thank you for the clarification. Creative in the context as not he's not making things out of thin air, but versus he's able to take what's in the Old Testament and give this in a new light. And so that is my first question. And the second one was,
Wait,
we
wait,
discussed.
before you go to your second one, let me just like when you're talking about taking things out of thin air, like I am not the last one to cast aspersions upon Jewish hermeneutic traditions, but um, the what first, second, third century rabbis, I think one of the most fundamental question around rabbinics and Talmud is where the hell did they get the authority to say these things? A lot.
That's right. So one could ask
Really,
from where did Jesus get?
at least in Jesus, you could say, oh, it's a separate tradition. In Judaism, we'll have, I read you one maybe 2 weeks ago, where we have a saying, don't read this text as this word, read it as this word. And in Hebrew, it's al tikra zeh ela zeh. Don't read it as this, read it that. And no one thinks that the rabbi who says this is trying to adjust the original biblical text. He's saying that the word is close enough to another word that sounds a bit like it that would teach me an idea. So if you did this in English, you would think the person's a lunatic. You would find this a worthless thing. Isaac kind of sounds like I zip, which means I zip a zipper. That's like the equivalent of doing it. And you'd be like, if Isaac zips a zipper, that would not be meaningful. But if Isaac regularly, his essence is zipping zippers. So I think the authority of the rabbis is always problematic. I actually asked Professor Hadari, the Talmud professor at YU, about this exact question, about where does this authority come from when it's so out of the original context of the verse. And it wouldn't have been anathema, but it would have been foreign, I believe, to the first people who hear it. There's a lot of Talmud professors who deal with this question. And I think it's so important to understand Jesus as one of the first century hermeneutics. You know, as we talked about, even with the prophecy fulfillments from Isaiah and from other places, they're kind of weak. They're almost like if the New Testament didn't say it, I wouldn't have said it, you wouldn't have said it. And we would have thought if someone said it, it's kind of like almost like a joke.
Well, the truth is, we didn't have a Paul. If had Paul been there, he'd have probably created some very creative.
Paul and Marcion, yeah, they would
Of
have yelled at this.
Yeah.
I think that it's so hard for us to put ourselves in these shoes, and the only context I kind of understand it from is that there's a strong tradition of creativity.
Mm-hmm.
The tradition is not necessarily the text being the end of the conversation, but the text as we're doing it being the beginning of the conversation.
Amen to that.
And
so in that context, he did not come to replace the law, but he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. So that's amen.
Well, I mean, the question is, though, you know, we talked about the dual meaning of fulfilled, which are actually opposites. One means that it's an end, and one means it's a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So it's from the way I read this text and the upcoming verses, it seems clear to me that Jesus, and we'll talk about this when we do verse 520, but it seems clear to me Jesus is a Mosaic law believer, and he is a Mosaic law practitioner. And at least from my humble opinion, if he would see Christians today, he'd be very surprised. I mean, this is the famous joke. If Moses saw Jews today, he wouldn't know who they are. If Jews saw Israelites today, they wouldn't know who they are. If first century Sadducees saw the Pharisees saw the Essenes.
They wouldn't know who they are. That's true. That is very true.
The Baptists and the Presbyterians are the only ones who can say, I know who you are and I don't like you. but everyone else, it will be like, it's so foreign. You know, it's always, you know, one of the beliefs, you know, especially if you believe the Messiah hasn't come yet, and you believe in the Jewish traditions the Messiah is yet to come, then you generally will also believe in a resurrection of the dead. And there's so many questions that come with resurrection, like what if you have a second wife who you married to? But you know, what is going to happen? There's a famous idea that when Moses gets resurrected and he sees what we're doing, he'll be like, I have no clue what you're doing. And so much so, just you might think I'm making this up, but there's even this very, very famous story in the Talmud, one of the more famous stories, where Rabbi Akiva, end of first century, beginning of second century rabbi, goes in a time machine. He has Moses, God sends Moses in a time machine to Rabbi Akiva's class in the beginning of the second century. And Moses says, I cannot understand one word of what this man is saying, but he's literally reading. He's not giving a crazy hermeneutic exposition. He's reading the Bible. And God says to him, Moses asked God, where did Akiva get this? He goes, he got it from the laws of Moses at Sinai. And it's meant to be cute, but it's also meant to be a very, I think, deep idea that there's this endless process of the infinitude of the Bible. And this is my little take on it. I don't really know what to say about this, but you could only go so far.
That's right.
And you could go as far as people let you. So the reason Christianity, I think, was able to get legs under it is because there are people who eventually followed it. If Paul and James and Peter, if they failed, then Jesus and Christianity would have been a memory lost. As long as there are people who are following you, you're not a heretic. A heretic is the person who doesn't have followers, who is called the other. So Jesus was a heretic for Jews, but he's not like the Jews become the heretics for Jesus or for Christians. So this is how I at least see these hermeneutics of text. So going back to the original question, Jesus' authority lies in the fact that he has people standing in front of him listening to him.
Good, thank you. Well, you probably set me up for my next question. We probably touched on this, where creativity and you can only go as far as the crowds allow you. And I would go on to say that that's why the Beatitudes are so central, because the essence of the Beatitudes does not change over time. They probably take different context on it. Blessed are the poor in spirit. It's true now as it was 2,000 years ago. Blessed are the meek. It's true now as it was 2,000 years ago. Now, the way in which we experience this is probably different now from back then, and I think that's why to me, I'm just
Well, what we're
the
saying
brilliance,
though
yeah, the
before,
brilliance
right?
of the brilliance of the evangelist to start with the Beatitudes, placing this at the center of the gospel. To me, that's just these timeless truths which have never changed and will never change, no matter how the world is. Right? These values form the shape of they inform the coming kingdom. Now, they'll probably have different contexts. They're probably
Well,
shown
for
different.
sure, 100%. Like, I keep it thinking, you and I have a concept of a first century meek and a 20th century meek or
Yeah,
21st century meek. And I think the words have very, very different meanings over time.
yeah,
It's
true.
very hard for us to even imagine how they were. And we do our best to contextualize it based on the comparative text in other places, but it's definitely very complicated.
Yeah, so to bring this even back home, what's meek in India might not be meek in America, and what's meek in New York City might not be meek in Kentucky, where I lived before. And so, but the essence of it is meekness, but it comes out different ways. This leads me on to my next question. A week ago we discussed, was he advocating for, was he subverting the model of discipleship, or was he subverting, like we
Yeah,
have a model.
what we said is we really don't have enough information yet
So here's
to
my
analyze
question.
the model
Now,
discipleship.
yeah, this is more of it might feel like more of an apologetic than the text, like based on the gospel, based on what he says in Mark and Luke and John. He speaks the Holy Spirit, and he says, "When I go, the Spirit will come, and He will teach you as to what He'll bring to your remembrance what the truth is." So, in a sense, right, he probably advocated for a subversive model of discipleship, which would have been completely different than what people knew in first century BC, or the first century in Judea, where you go to rabbi, you live with them, and then you learn from them,
Well,
and
I
you're
mean, that
shaped up
was
by
one
them.
model.
But
We don't know how wide it is, right? I think that it can't be discipleship would have been so different for Jesus because then people wouldn't know what he's talking about. He always has to work within his first century framework. Jesus doesn't use microwaves. He can only work with it. So I
yeah,
think that the mentor model of a person being sent away out of home in order to learn with his mentor and to learn a trade, let it be Torah or carpentry. I think that we'll have to see. I think we were specifically bothered by our fisherman tales, where he's just like, "Come on, guys,"
come on,
and
guys.
all, and all of a sudden they're Christians. So that model of discipleship seems more miraculous and a submission than a partnership or a relationship building. And
Hmm.
let's be honest, even what we're seeing right now, a sermon on a mound is a unilateral experience. It is not a discipleship. It's saying that you guys can be my students if you want, but if you guys aren't here, I'm still emanating my truths from me. Whenever you go on a dais, you're always alone.
So isn't that because Jesus is both, he's viewed as both teacher and Lord? So I think what you described as being a teacher, as the teacher will teach, but he's both a teacher and he is God and he is Lord, which then means like we don't have any models to understand him, or there were no people, there's just nobody before him through whom we can
We
understand.
definitely understand God unilaterally acting because that's all we have in
Oh,
for
yeah,
the
that's
part
right.
of
Yeah.
our lives. Those people who claim the bilateral relationship a lot of times, suffer philosophically as you try to understand what a bilateral relationship would mean. This is one of the things that Rabbi Jonathan Sachs talks about in his book Morality, about that you need to understand that about that you're having this bilateral relationship.
Have you
And
read the book? Have you read the book?
yeah, I've skimmed. I haven't read it. I read some of it this morning even. I was just looking through it, and my brother has it. So a lot of times when we talk about this, you're saying that we really don't have a precursor to understand what it means to be a king or a Jew
That's
or
right.
God.
Yeah, that's right.
But
Yeah.
I'm not sure that, nonetheless, independent discipleship. sermons are lonely. You know, you're up there by yourself.
Yes. Okay. Well, on that
That's it.
note, yeah, I think
Okay, Isaac. Okay.
that's enough. Yeah.